The models that are kind of like not the top quality are getting cheaper and cheaper, but the ones that are top quality, they're getting more expensive. So people think about there's a runway to the bottom on the LLM price, but it's not true. The models that are kind of like the cream de la crop, they are getting more expensive over time. I think with GPT-5, we saw like a almost 100% kind of like increase. So they double it. And even with kind of like Claude 4.7, they actually changed the tokenizer, and that already expanded like in 35 to 40% the actual kind of like cost of running the model. Unless we keep seeing investments into kind of like open source models, I think that will create two versions of the future, right? One where more people have access to this intelligence and when people have less access to this intelligence. And I think that will define a little bit of kind of like how much of power will be controlled by few and how much power will be controlled by many in this future.
Welcome to the Main Branch podcast. This is your host, Chala Kaimaz. Main Branch is a show where I talk to founders and early adopters about building, deploying, and scaling world-class AI startups. Welcome, Joe. You're the founder and CEO of CrewAI, which has become one of the most popular frameworks in building agentic systems. Your open source project has over 50,000 stars. You work with over 50% of Fortune 500. I think last we chatted was close to 65%, which is incredible. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm very excited to chat about it. I got to say, running this company has been has been quite a show. It's just like one of those times in the industry where things are moving so damn fast that is very exciting. But thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about this.
So assume I know nothing. Assume we have never chatted. Tell me about CrewAI. Like, what's your 1-minute elevator pitch?
Yes. So I would say CrewAI exists to basically help people adopt AI agents faster, especially companies, especially enterprises. So what we notice is many of these companies are stuck, right? But there is a huge value on the other side if they manage to adopt AI agents. And a lot of that goes back to the fact that it is a very small subset of people that are able to deploy, build, and trust these use cases. So we help them close that gap.
As I mentioned, like you're one of the most popular frameworks. These days, people are not calling a lot of things frameworks. It sounds like almost frameworks are dead, and now we're on to harnesses. And with harnesses, like you have other things like memory, reasoning, orchestration, like kind of built in. What's your view on these like two concepts? How do they relate? How are they different? Are frameworks dead?
It's funny because there's a lot of conversation about, oh, frameworks are dead, frameworks are gone, harness is the new thing, right? And in the end of the day, I had a hard time wrapping my head around it and take this as someone that is in the frontier of the industry, right? We're building these things. And I later kind of like made my peace with that because I was having a hard time because when I look at like what people have been calling harnesses and the difference between a framework and a harness, I realized that we have been in a harness all along. The way that I would explain it for people that have no clue about what we're talking about is framework. Think about like the building blocks, right? So it's kind of like it's giving you a way to create an agent, it's giving you a way to do memory, it's giving you a way to do knowledge, it's giving you a way to do all these different pieces. But you are the one that is actually like stringing these things together, putting them together, and make sure that they work. And then it's almost like you have a spectrum. There's not a clean cut, but from that, you start to get more and more opinionated all the way to the point that you have something like Cloud Code, right? Cloud Code it is an agent, but it works outside the box. It already has memory. It already has knowledge. It already has all these things. So you don't do stitching things together. You don't even do any configuration. You just turn it on and it's ready to go. The more you get into the opinionated range, the more people start to calling this a harness, right? So for CrewAI, it's funny because we started with a very opinionated, what some people would call back in the day a higher level abstraction of agents. Because you create an agent, but already comes with memory, already comes with this idea of delegation, already come with this idea of learning and all that. And you just do some configuration. And eventually we open source the framework behind it as well, so people could actually use it. So that has been funny, but yeah, it's very confusing out there nowadays. I think people are trying to understand what I'm using. Like I'm using a framework, I'm using a harness, what I'm building, and everything in between. But I would say in the end of the day, it's a matter of like how opinionated that abstraction are. And the more opinionated, the more it starts to resemble a harness. The less opinionated, the more is just loose pieces that you actually string along yourself.
Are you seeing any differences between like certain type of engineers or certain type of companies that want to use a harness versus a framework?
Yeah, sure. It's definitely like I think that there's almost a place for both in a way, where like the framework gives you way more control. So in a framework, you can control almost like if this then that in a way in certain like ways, and you can have like way to swap memory in one way or another and all that. And the agents end up being a little more kind of like out of the box, so you can kind of like string them along together. In the reality, what we're seeing work most out there is like both intertwined. So we
Hmm.
see a lot of use cases where there is certain pieces that are going to be very deterministic and you want to have a lot of control on them, on like how these things are going to actually work. But then you might have pockets of like agency that you want these agents to just go out there and do all the work that you need, and you want these agents to be pre-configured for you, and then people would go for that. That's kind of like the most common pattern that we're seeing
Mhm.
when talking about, well, our framework's dead. The case to be made there around like frameworks being dead is this idea that you can build anything now, right? And like, well, do you need a framework if you can just prompt your custom framework into existence? And I don't see a world where that's real for frameworks and that is not a real for harnesses as well. Again, harnesses is just like that framework with opinions on
Mhm.
top of it, right? Like things
Mhm.
predefined. So I don't see a reason why that wouldn't be the next victim of like of LLMs in that way. If you truly believe that those things are being killed.
If I heard you correctly, you're saying like the harnesses could be the next victim, or frameworks could be the next
I
victim.
think honestly, like harnesses and you could build a use case that any software is the next victim, right? And in the end of the day, I think like a lot of the companies are fearing that, right? The whole
Mhm.
SaaSpocalypse story is about that. It's about people prompting their way into software instead of like buying software out of the box, and everyone trying to understand, well, how do I position my
Mhm.
software on this? And I think that's a little bit of what getting people scared on this.
I mean, if harnesses are getting close to the chopping block, I think you recently wrote about like this entangled software and like what comes potentially after harnesses. There's like the entangled agentic systems concept. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Like, what's your vision on what's the next big thing or next couple big things?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of people get me this question, right? I think like people look at us and say like, "All right, you folks called multi agents back in 2023, and no one was talking about multi agents." If anything, I actually got a lot of trouble to talk about multi agents because people would say multi agents will never be a thing because one agent hallucinates. If you do three agents, they're going to hallucinate elevated to three, so there's going to be 95% hallucination. But now everyone agrees, like, no, multi-agents is the way to go.
Mhm.
So people now come to me and ask it, like, all right, multi-agents are good. What is coming next? The way that I think about it, it feels like the where the puck's going is this idea of the agents improving over time. Because it doesn't really matter how much opinions you put into an agent, they still are leaving all those learnings from the actually executions on the table. So the idea of like self-improving and self-learning, and not only by creating memories, but creating its own skills, by creating its own flows, and kind of like self-evolving and self-modifying itself seems to be a lot of like where you can really get long-term benefits. And then the more I start to thinking about this idea, I was like, well, these almost use another way to get into the quote unquote same result that you would get by vibe coding something, right? If people think, well, I can create my own agent, I can create my own software, I can create my own SaaS instead of buying it, and I would just vibe code my way there, I'm going to prompt my way there. I almost see a reverse like path to that, where you get an existing agent or framework or harness or software, and the more you use it, the more it starts to adapt itself to you. I think some people might be calling it adaptive software. I start calling it entangled software, entangled agents. And it's this idea of the agents learning from the usage and then even modifying themselves along the process. And then we start basically play around with these concepts internally ourselves and get a few customers to try it out. And honestly, the results are kind of like just incredible. So I have strong belief that the whole idea about not only memory itself, but like this idea of self-improving and kind of like self-learning is gonna be like the next biggest thing in terms of like the cutting edge of AI agent development.
I mean, I'm fascinated by adaptive software. Like, I don't know why my version of Affinity needs to look like your version of Affinity for completely different use cases, right? But it also feels like we're a little bit far out from that. Like, I don't know if you're going to get there in 6 months, 9 months, in a couple of years. Like, are you guys already experimenting with this self-learning agents? Like, do you have anything in practice you're already using?
Yes, we are. We actually have a few internal agents that are fully kind of like turned into that. So basically, they are not only being used, but they're also always in watch mode. They're like learning from conversations they're observing, conversations that they engage, conversations that they don't engage at all. But they're like just learning and capturing all those learnings. And we're trying many different things. We tried like the dreaming kind of like approach where like every few hours they go over a dreaming state where they go over all their memories and then collapse them into learnings and all that. We did the self-creating skills, the self-creating flows route as well, that has been interesting. And from some of the more complex agents, we even make them open PRs against themselves. So the engineers can then go in and kind of like merge and they are updating their own code based on their learnings. And we're seeing like massive results from that. I mean, it's very interesting to see like if you go week in, week out, like for a few weeks, like things start just to work. And then like starts to have more integrations because it starts building its own integrations. You start to understand more about your business units, your leaders, your teams, and how they work together. And that has been like honestly mesmerizing to watch sometimes. So I'm very excited to think about what the future of like having agentic organizations actually looks like. We're now thinking about potentially creating. We have this pod structure on our teams on the engineering side. So it's all like small teams. We're thinking about creating a full agentic pod where like it's a product, a designer, an engineer, everything is agentic in there, and see how that would work out as a next experiment now.
That's fascinating. I think you mentioned like memory when you were talking about this, like using memory and getting learnings out of this. I think you also have a very differentiated approach to like memory as cognition versus memory as storage. Like a lot of times when people think about agentic memory, they're thinking, hey, we're just going to store embeddings in a very fast vector DB. We're just going to retrieve information on the go. Versus I think you're using like LensDB under the hood, which I'm a big fan of, but you're doing something more sophisticated on top. Like that includes like importance, recency, and other metrics. Like what's your approach to memory today?
I'm so glad that you bring this up. I mean, you definitely did your homework going through the blog post there. By seeing the blog post, you can see how we're thinking about things and how I'm spending my time thinking about the technical side of things. So we started with this idea of self-improvement of like, well, for us to do self-improvement, we need to have a better memory. And that's kind of like how we start building the memory first and where that blog post came about. In the end of the day, right? If you let's just be very raw and real. Let's remove all the idea of hardness, all the idea of framework. Let's remove all that and just talk about what's happening in there. LLM is intelligence for hire. So you're paying for getting some sort of intelligence is something that we're never able to do before. So you're getting this token, right? And your job as an engineering creating an agent is like how I make sure that the value for every token that I'm getting is more than what I'm paying, right? So whatever I'm paying for the token, I need to get that like amazing value back. And the end of the day, the way that you extract the best token is by doing context engineering. That's the most simplistic way to think about it. So you're like, hey, I'm doing all this idea of put the right prompts, the right memory, the right things to create this context that when I send this message, I know that I'm going to extract the best intelligence, the best token that I can. And that token will basically be 2x more valuable for my company that I'm paying for. And memory goes a long way to that. So a lot of the context engineering goes back to like being able to provide the right amount of information. And if you think about a memory as just to store and retrieve data, you're leaving a lot of like value on the table. Because the same way that we humans, when we like think about something and you want to remember something, we just don't remember it. We create all sorts of associations. We start to remember how this is associated with something else and all that. A good example that we use is, for example, we at the company, we used to use one database provider and we moved to another database provider. If all that you did was just storing this into a database, now you have a database that tells you that you use two databases, right? So, but if you actually use like some sort of cognition to, at the time of storing this, looking for similar things and kind of like trying to think about how you consolidate them, you now can store that you actually migrated databases. You can store why you migrated databases. You can store your learnings from that migration. So there's a bunch of knowledge that is implied and that you can infer from even the comparison itself. So that's kind of like what we implemented at CrewAI. And we even run benchmarks on it. And it's actually pretty remarkable.
I mean, for the example you gave in terms of like which database you're using now versus what you used to use, obviously it doesn't depend on like the intelligence under the hood, like it's a factual information that needs to be stored as such. Do you find memory changing depending on the intelligence you're using under the hood, like how strong and how powerful the model is? Versus like, I mean, I want to also ask you about these like token costs and open source models and so forth. Or do you think like memory stays the same no matter what the underlying model is?
I mean, honestly, you can remain the same, but you're going to be leaving like some money on the table, right? Like you can definitely optimize it. So when you think about like the bigger the model, the more expensive it is, the more smart it is. So that means that you can basically extract more knowledge from it. The other thing is that depending on the model, like if it's a different family of models, that probably means that a different prompt style needs to go off that. So like not exactly the same context engineering that you would do for Anthropic is the same one that you're going to do for kind of like a GPT 5.5. So when I think about that is, yes, there needs to be changes in there. I would say it's less about the memory though. It might be more about how you leverage that memory. The way that it works in CrewAI now is when an agent's trying to store an information, to store a memory, it actually goes through that process that I described from consolidated, from understanding importance, relevance, and all that, and saving that in the database. And some of this metadata actually decay over time. So it's almost like starts forgetting over time, like if it's not relevant anymore. But then the process of retrieving the data also is an agentic system where depending on the model that you're using and how much context you need, it might not only retrieve that information, but actually pull entire thread of related context that you want to inject in the model. And you do want to optimize that per model. You don't necessarily need to, and it will just work, especially in the bigger ones. But the more you get into particular models, the more you optimize, the better. Again, in the end of the day, folks that are doing the agentic engineering, their job is get the most valuable token out.
I mean, this is, I think, a good segue to talk about these token costs, right? Like you work with a lot of enterprises that have very scaled usage. I'm assuming they're starting to worry about their token costs if they haven't already. What are you seeing, especially for larger like Fortune 500s in terms of their adoption of maybe open source models or interest in trying something local?
I mean, you go back a year, right? I would tell everyone that I thought that fine tuning would be huge and all that. And it's funny to see that didn't came true, right? Like fine tuning is not as huge as I thought it could, even though I think that it could actually be extremely big. But then I didn't even see many people using local models. A lot of people are just like defaulting to like this, either the hyperscalers or kind of like the big labs. And the hyperscalers is just because they're throwing credits around so much, right? Like if you're already a customer from like Azure and you have like this huge commitment to spend $10 million with them, well, you better use it on tokens, right? So people are kind of like using it in that way. But I think now I'm starting to see people actually using local models. So I can't name the customer, but it's a huge customer on kind of like the FSI branch. And they are actually using like a bunch of open source models now. They're set up things like Gwen, DeepSeek, Llama. There's a bunch of new models coming up out of NVIDIA now as well, new Nemotron models that are actually pretty damn good. And even like new models like Gemma 4 that now Google released under Apache 2 that people are trying out and using it. So it's funny because everyone saw, I think, like the Uber news like a couple weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, where they're saying like, hey, we had a budget of tokens for the year. And now it's like May and we're already done. Like we're already using it before. And we're seeing more and more companies actually come up with that. So I think there's two things that are going to come from this. There's going to be like a chair dance a little bit where like people are going to be a little more strict with like their token consumption. So like you got to win your right to spend those tokens. So for companies like us, that means that we need to step up big time on like ROI, show you the value and all that, right? I think people that have been selling on base of FOMO, they're going to see a lot of that start melting away for them. And I think that the other thing as well is there's going to be more people open to not only fine-tune, but local models in general. So I think that's going to be a trend this year.
I mean, the beauty with Crew is it doesn't matter which model they're using, right? Like they can still work with you. So I think you're safe on that front. And I'm with you on the fine-tuning. Like I remember thinking 2-3 years ago, enterprise have all this data, you know, they are in the best position to fine tune or even like train eventually. But we haven't seen that taking off. I think like this general intelligence has been good enough so far. I think people are still like, okay, overspending potentially and still figuring out the ROI part. But there's so much pressure for AI adoption that I don't think people have started to like optimized using fine tuning or other methods as much. So you work with a lot of enterprises, as we just mentioned. And what's fascinating is not all of them are like tech companies, right? Like Fortune 500 that has other companies like CPG, logistics, manufacturing, and I think you work with a bunch of them. What kind of use cases are you seeing them adopting? Let's say let's take out like the tech companies in the Valley. What are you seeing outside of the Valley in terms of enterprise use cases?
Yeah, I gotta say, funny enough, that's where we're seeing most success as a company. So if you look at our customers are not your Ubers and DoorDashes, right? Our customers are like Johnson and Johnson, PepsiCo, AB InBev, right? Experian. It's like these large enterprises that they do have amazing technical teams, but they're not necessarily associated like, oh, this is like a tech company, like the same way that Uber is, right? So that's kind of like where we're seeing a lot of our success in there. And honestly, it's fun because if you think about it, with all this conversation about AI, you look at even like an S&P 500, right? And you see the Mag 7 just skyrocketing. But like, what about the other 493 companies? A lot of the companies in there are not tech companies. And they're the ones that are promised to get the value of AI, right? Like all the investment and infrastructure is based on this promise that like, hey, you folks will get the value from this. And they're trying to understand how to grab this bull by the horns. And I think like we're showing up with a platform that is complete. There is batteries included with experience knowing it's about working, and they're choosing us for that. If I think about the use cases, it's interesting because there's almost like a maturity curve. So when they initially come to us, they come a lot thinking about like how do I put it, like savings, right? They want to save money in a way. So they're thinking about, well, how I reduce costs with AI agents. But then right after that, they start thinking about, all right, how I generate revenue with AI agents. And then right after that, they start thinking about how I innovate, like what are things that I would not be able to do. We have a company that is a huge CPG, and they started with a very simple use case. It was kind of like a discount use case. So they basically had a dedicated team to do a bunch of approvals for discounts, and they basically replaced all that with CrewAI, and they moved that people into something else. And that was massive for them. Like we're talking about 96, 97% efficiency gains in terms of like how many hours they're spending on this process.
Help me understand like the discount use case.
They have around 150,000 employees, and they have a policy that many teams can just ask for discounts. And you would have marketing team asking for discounts for doing events. You would have sales teams asking for discounts to help closing a customer, whatever it might be, right? And that was a very manual process for people actually approving. There was parts of that process that was very deterministic, but there was parts of the process that had like a judgment call, or like someone willing to say, this is approved, this is not approved. And they end up, that volume of those requests became so large on a global level that they had a dedicated team that all their job was just approving or denying those processes. And then they start experimenting with agents using CrewAI to do that process. And they basically build the agents and they did a backwards test. So they run like last 30 days, how much the agent would have approved or denied. And they found that it actually matched the human behavior 94% of time. And they're like, yeah, this is pretty good. I mean, if we can identify the other 6% and we can delegate that to a human, that feels like we could roll this out. And then when they roll it out, they realize that the amount of time they're spending is now like only 3% of what they used to spend before. Because now when people show up to do something manual of one of those 6%, is more of like everything is in there. They have a description, they have an understanding, and the bulk of the requests are already automatically approved. So that was their first use case. It was very kind of like efficiency gains, cost saving kind of like use case, right? But then you look at like some of the latest use cases they're doing. They have been a customer for like over a year now. And they're doing use cases where they're using agents to automatically approve kind of like legal documents and kind of like things that they just couldn't do at scale, right? I won't name the customer, but I'll tell you this. They have hundreds of beverage brands under them. So there's only a couple companies that would fit into that. They had this thing where they would go into their customers or potential customers and they would say, hey, I'll get you the paperwork that you need to have my product, and I will get you that paperwork, figure it out. And that will cost me $1 million. That will cost me a lot of time. But if I do it, then you buy from me for their first 5 million of purchase. These customers would say, like, yes, for sure. I mean, I don't want to figure that out. I don't want to go through that process. Let's do that. But the problem is that that worked so well that they now have thousands of those licenses that they own, but it's not theirs, it's for their customers. And they need to renew that process every year. And they now lose times, they get fines, it becomes a nightmare, right? So what they decided to do is basically use agents to automate the whole process of those license renewals. And by doing that, they now, yes, they're saving money because they're not getting like millions that they're expending before between fines and people on this, but they actually get to expand this growth hack across the globe. So they're very excited about that. So again, it is funny to see how usually they start with like, I want to save costs, I want to get efficiency gains. But eventually they start to like think about, well, I couldn't do this at this scale, but now I can with agents. And then they start going on that route.
I mean, those use cases are so different from each other. At the same time, like your platform is fairly flexible to serve both of those. I'm assuming for some of these customers, like you go in, they've not built an agent before. They're like, where do we even start? And I remember watching your deep learning course a couple of years ago. You were pretty good at like bringing people along and like teaching them how to use these systems. One thing I want to try with you today, if you're open to this, I want to see how you would workshop something like that. Like you go into an Fortune 500, you're working with a bunch of senior engineers, they have some sort of a workflow they want to automate in their mind, and they're saying, hey, Joe, help us like architect this. Like, what do we do? I would love for you to walk me through that.
Let me do this. I have an easy one, but again, the sky is the limit. So let me share my screen. So in order to keep this simple, I'm using the platform alone. The open source will allow you to basically code, so you can do a lot of super complex things in there, but I think this will make it a little easier for us to understand. Usually when these customers come to us, if they already have a use case, there's a process of understanding the actual use case. If this use case is going to be more deterministic, if it's going to be less deterministic, and what that's going to look like. So we do go through a process of actually sketching it out, drawing, and thinking all that. If they don't have a use case, we actually have this idea of discovery. Discovery allows them to understand what they should build, right? So I can come in here, for example, and let me say Coke. Coke is not a customer of ours, but if they were, I could say like, hey, like Coke wants to build some use cases. They have BigQuery, they have Databricks, DocuSign, they are a huge Microsoft customer, and they use Zoom, whatever it might be, right?
Joe, this would be their teams using it, or this would be your team or you walking them through this workflow?
That could be both. So like at this stage, that could be their team. But we have kind of like a deeper access on our side that allow us to do more fancy stuff, right? There's a few building blocks in here that people might care about. So one is agents. Like you want to reuse as many agents you can. So you can create agents. We have some in here that we use very often, but you can create new ones. Or you can bring external agents as well. So we have companies right now that have CrewAI managing, for example, ServiceNow agents, where you can bring ServiceNow agents using A2A, or even like Agentforce agents or ADK, LangGraph agents, whatever it might be. As long as it supports A2A, you can bring them in here. The other big building block is this idea of tools, right? Things that your agents can use. We have a bunch built out of the box, so you can use all these different connections. You can bring your own MCP servers if you want to, or you can create custom ones. So you can see that we don't have an integration with Phantom, so I end up creating my own, and people can actually use this in our organization. I control who has access and everything. The way that I like to use this is basically by just chatting my way into an automation. So I have one in here that I got ready just for us to try it out. It's kind of like a simple one, but I could deploy this in any sales organization and it would work. So this says like, hey, given someone's email, I want you to research them and their company deeply, and then cross any relevant data in our HubSpot with that, and then cross any emails that I have exchanged in my Gmail with them, and prepare me for a sales call.
But I'm sure you get this semi-annoying question. Often someone comes to you and they say, hey, actually my salesperson, they just like create the skill in Cloud Code. Like they have this research agent they're working with. Like, why do I need Crew? Like, why don't we just do this in Cloud? Like, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I gotta say, the cool thing is like Claude has proven to be a great tool for us actually, because what we're doing is we connect the platform directly in Claude. So we understand that people don't necessarily want to come into the platform, and I think that's fine. I mean, you got to meet these customers where they are. What we're finding is that more than Claude Cowork, like bringing these things into actually IEMs like Slack or Teams is where people are really like getting
Mm.
to usage. But we actually have an integration straight with kind of like things like Cloud Cowork. So you can in
Ah,
there run the same use cases or pull the same things. But now you go from like a more single player like Cowork to something more multiplayer like Crew. And on top of that, you start to have all these settings where you can do not only quality and visibility, but
mhm,
add human the loop, cost alerts, remove PII. You have like controls around your spenders, your use cases, how many
mhm.
tokens are going into our LLMs and all that. So
Yeah.
it's more kind of like enterprise ready that gives availability for that like InfoSec and IT team to feel
Mhm.
comfortable and to actually deploy these things and allowing people to use them.
This is pretty cool. And it also gives us like a sense of what you have outside of open source, right? Like a lot of times, I'm a big like fan of open source, but sometimes, founders give away too much in the open source. And then it's hard to monetize, like commercialize it after. How did you approach it? Like when, your open source project is extremely popular and then you have the studio and, you have a couple other enterprise like features that are not part of the open source. When you decide on like what to put in the open source and what to put behind a paywall, like how do you go about it?
Well, honestly, I think there's two kinds of open source companies. I would say there's probably more, but there's two like on a high level. One is kind of like the Mongo playbook, where you say like, hey, I have like Mongo open source, and I'll stop using Mongo open source, and I'm going to start use Mongo Enterprise, right? So you're migrating. And then you have like companies like Vercel, where like I'm using Next.js. I'm not going to stop using Next.js, but I'm going to bring Next.js into my Vercel account, right? And we are more of the latter. So it's not like, hey, the enterprise replaces the open source, but it's more like you get whatever you're doing on the open source and you bring it here. Like whatever
Mhm.
you build on the open source, you can deploy here and you have all the same metrics and the same features and everything in between. So the idea is to extend the open source. Now, we do behind the scenes have a private fork of the open source. That is when you deploy is what we use. And that
Mhm.
is faster, supports load, and have a bunch of other things as well that we do behind the scenes that's exciting. But in the end of the day, you're not stopping using the open source for this. And the open source is very geared towards like that engineering persona that is trying to build something on their computer, right? But the gap between that and getting something into production, the last mile is more like 1,000 miles. Like there's a lot in there from like the integrations, the access, the controls, and all that that do get in the way. And in the end of the day, a lot of for deals and our customers is less about that and it's more about accelerating adoption as a whole, right? If they
Mhm.
say like, all right, I have a subset of people or a subset of engineers that can build agents, that allows me to move fast. But if I can unlock many of builders, not necessarily even only engineers, but I can unlock many builders throughout my company and bring all the power and the ease of use of CrewAI into the people that are actually doing the work, and they can automate it in a way that is like basically complying to central rules, then that is where like transformation really happens.
I mean, I agree with you. Like a lot of times there's so much more after the demo that needs to be done. But at the same time, like open source is so helpful to just like get started. And I hear a lot of enterprises saying, hey, like before we adopt especially a dev tool, like we want to try it out. And then like you don't want to go through the whole procurement and onboarding. So it's much easier for them to like try out the open source. Another thing I want to get your thoughts on, like you've done such a good job building the community and the brand and the narrative around Crew. What are some things that worked for you? Like let's say you were a DevTools founder starting today, you're building an open source. What are two, three things you would definitely do to build out the community and build out the narrative?
Well, it's funny because I always loved open source, right? Before CrewAI, I had like other 3 or 4 projects that were like what people would call successful. Nothing as big as CrewAI, but like thing that got like millions of downloads in a month. In the end of the day, it was all about the fact that you got to be using it, right? I think the reason why CrewAI grew up to be what it is from the open source side was actually because I needed that. I needed something and I did it for myself. I never set out to say, I'm going to launch a framework. I'm going to launch a harness. I'm going to launch a company. I set out to say like, hey, I'm building these agents and damn, it doesn't feel like very ergonomic. And I was like, I wish there was something out there that was easier to use and meant for production. And that's how I start to abstract those things away. And I just start to put myself out there. And then the more that I put myself out there and the more that I talk about the framework, I think more people start to resonate with those
How did you put
ideas.
yourself out there? Like, what are some concrete things you did?
I did a lot of video recording. I mean, I remember my wife would get like pissed off at me because she was like, "Hey, I need to leave. We need to leave in half an hour." And I was like, "Let me record a quick video. I didn't do a video today still." And she knew that once I start recording the video, it's gonna be like 2 hours. But I remember getting like late into a bunch of like things that we would commit to just because I was recording videos and then editing them on the way. She was driving and I had was my computer just editing, adding subtitles and everything. But it was just a lot of doing that, just like doing tech talks, like pushing videos. And again, it didn't feel like marketing. It felt like here's the cool thing that I did. Like here's the cool thing that I built, a new agent, a new crew, something that I'm using for myself. And that really resonated with people back then. The other thing that I would say, if I had to do an advice for someone, is like be opinionated. I think another big thing about like why CrewAI worked out is we're very opinionated from the get-go.
So be a harness, not a framework.
Not necessarily be a harness on the context
joking.
of crew
Yeah.
of no, but I think you're right. It's like being a harness on the context of like a agent, but even on the framework level. If you say I'm gonna build a framework, be opinionated about what you're giving it to users, right? I think like when people feel like, especially in a new tech like this, where no one knows how necessarily to build it, there's no right or wrong. Everyone's trying to figure out what is the conventions, what are the new protocols and everything, right? There's something to be gained by saying like, this is the way that I think you should do it, right? And if you're wrong, no one cares. No one will bat an eye. But if you're right and people appreciate that, then that is the opportunity where you can take off. So I think from the get-go, that's how and why I say we first build a harness before we build a framework. We out of the gate, we came with very strong opinions, right? Of like how these agents would work and how they would be, and the fact that it was multi-agents and the fact that they all would be role-playing. And people really resonated with those opinions.
And how do you think about today? Like, do you have DevRels or are you still doing a lot of that yourself?
I think the fact that I did that for so long was detrimental for the company. And the reason why I say that is it took me a long time to start delegating that. And I think that almost like that created a culture that a lot kept coming back to me on the marketing side of things. Now we're changing that and I'm happy about it. But it took us extra effort because for a long, long time, I was the one that like just out there doing videos every week and kind of like putting things out there. I still want to do it. It's just that like I'm spread super thin nowadays, and that makes it harder.
I mean, you are the face of the company, and sounds like you enjoy the videos and the tech talks and all of that. So I'm sure part of it is like you wanting to continue to do it, but you only have so many hours in the day, and you need to delegate a little bit of that.
Exactly.
I have 2 quick questions for you to wrap this up. What's the vision for CrewAI? Like, no one knows what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years, but if you had to guess, what is Crew doing in 5 years?
There's companies that have a small TAM. There's companies that have big TAM, and then there's AI agents, right? Like when you think about AI agents, we're talking about the future of work. So I think that's one of the things that makes it so hard to predict where things will go. But I can tell you a little bit of kind of like what I want for the company and what I want for our team. We're a company that we're very empathetic as a company. I think we understand and we put ourselves on our customers' shoes. I think we understand why AI agents are so valuable and how transformational they can be. But we also understand that a bunch of these companies out there, they're struggling. You go into Twitter, you go into X and LinkedIn, and like there's going to be people celebrating. But you go out of that bubble and you go talk with this real business out there, they're struggling actually adopting the stack and getting this out there. And they're almost getting sick of hearing about tomorrow's new thing while they're trying to deploy yesterday's thing still. So I think there's a lot of kind of like helping them getting there and build a product for them, right? To help them like getting the adoption. So I would love for us to grow into the kind of company that enable these companies to become agentic, to materialize that future for them, right? And you're going to have people that are responsible for managing like not only this multitude of agents within like their business unit and kind of like their organization, but you're going to have those people within these companies that are responsible for controlling kind of like the guardrails and kind of like all the rules and policies and everything. So I think that's a little bit on the future that we're going. And even us internally, we're seeing that happen, right? There's people inside CrewAI that are becoming more of like this control plane managers. They're keeping tabs on what is going on and helping kind of like make sure it's doing away while enabling everyone on the kind of like the edges to actually build their use cases and kind of like start distributing them. So for me, it's very clear that one, the genie is not getting the bottle. There's no word where people are going to stop using AI. There's no word that people are not going to use AI agents and all that. But definitely like right now, the budgets are being way more scrutinized. People are way more focused on these things like actually seeing the light of the day. Is less about volume of like use cases and more about actual like outcomes and results that you're getting from these use cases. So it's almost like the tide like is changing in terms of like now everyone wants to get a real, and we're about to see like, all right, who is actually real about this and not. So I think that's going to be an interesting point in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this gap between AI capability and adoption quite a bit. I think that gap right now is increasing, unfortunately, but I think we're going to hit a point where the gap starts, like, hopefully, at least like keeping up and not increasing anymore. Because when you think about like the bubble we live in versus like some of the outside of the valley companies or even like internationally, right? Like we're just scratching the surface of how people are using AI agents, and there's like so much to be done. And it sounds like CrewAI is going to continue to play a big role in this. And my last question for you is, this is an even harder one because we're going to go way to 2050, like stretching your imagination. What's happening in 2050? No one knows, but are we living in this like post-scarcity, like Star Trek universe where things are peaceful and we have these like AI collaborators working with us, or is it like something else? What's your vision?
I think like a lot hinges on a few things, right? I think like a lot of we'll go back to open source models. I think so. I think for me that we're running a company where we're using AI so much and LLM so much, it's easy for you to forget that there is almost like two prices going on, right? The models that are kind of like not the top quality are getting cheaper and cheaper, but the ones that are top quality, they're getting more expensive, right? So people think about there's a runway to the bottom on the LLM price, but it's not true. The models that are kind of like the cream de la crop, they are getting more expensive over time. I think with GPT-5, we saw like a almost 100% kind of like increase. So they double it. And even with kind of like Claude 4.7, they actually changed the tokenizer, and that already expanded like in 34 to 35 to 40% the actual kind of like cost of running the model. So in the end of the day, unless we keep seeing investments into kind of like open source models, I think that will create two versions of the future, right? One where more people have access to this intelligence and when people have less access to this intelligence. And I think that will define a little bit of kind of like how much of power will be controlled by few and how much power will be controlled by many in this future. I truly believe that there's a lot of incentives for people to actually keep pushing kind of like open source models. And I know there are companies that are deeply committed with that. I'm very excited about what NVIDIA is cooking, for example, with Nemotron models recently. And I think that is great. We also see other great models coming from outside of the US, right? We're seeing like the Deep Six, the Kimis, the Quens. We're also seeing the Mistrals and all that. There is kind of like a race on that open source model stage as well. And as long as those keep getting better in a similar rate to like the closed source ones, even if they're not like at the same level just yet, I do feel more optimistic about the future. But it's very clear that the future will be very Star Trek-y on that way. Like it's gonna be like it's going back 50 years ago, even 5 years ago, you wouldn't believe that it would be working the way that we do. For engineers specifically that I think are feeling it as the most, you go back 6 months ago and people would not have gas that would be working on the way that we're doing. So yeah, 50 years from now, I would bet on robots, like physical AI, physical agents, and everything in between.
Lots to hopefully look forward to. This was awesome, Joe. I know we're at time. Really appreciate you joining me. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This was great, and I hope everyone watching and listening in had a lot of fun.